Street Smart, written by C.F. White, narrated by Piers Ryman. Chapter 1. Marching Orders. You need to leave. Damon peered up, one eye on his sister's looming presence as she stood over him, slumbering on the tatty sofa. Her tatty sofa. Like now. She emphasized her point by scraping open the curtains, sending piercing sunlight flooding onto him like an interrogation spotlight. Rubbing his eyes, Damon attempted to scoot up from where he sprawled out on his front by pushing on his hands. Stupid move. He winced, hissed, then collapsed down face first into the thin scatter cushion. Oh God, please don't start with that again. Damon glowered up at his big sister. She was an almost exact replica of their mother with her folded arms and fierce frown. But although her words were harsh, they held more fear than their mum's exasperation had when she'd had enough of his antics. He couldn't blame Kelly, though. This was her flat. Why are you kicking me out? Damon asked, voice cracking from the sudden wake-up call. Kelly glanced away, biting her glossy red lips. Damon didn't need her to answer. Not now he could take in her decked-out gear. Easily removable, no fiddly buttons. A wrap-around dress that one tug would reveal her, no doubt, matching underwear that only came out for him. I thought you'd finished with him, Damon tusked, throwing his legs over the side of the sofa to sit. God, he was groggy. Head banging, mouth dry, and the constant throbbing pain in his fingers liked to remind him of how much of a twat he was. He tried to wiggle them to relieve the morning swelling, but it didn't help, and he hung his head to wait for the stars dotting his vision to fade. Don't start, Damon. Kelly straightened out her sleek blonde hair and checked her reflection in the mirror hung above the electric fireplace. You know full well why I can't finish with him. He did. Because if she did, she'd be in the same position as he was right then. Anyway, where were you last night? Heard you scramble in at around 1. Damon rubbed each knuckle, trying to alleviate the telltale signs of his stupidity. He shrugged. Kelly huffed and twisted on her heels to fall with a harumph onto the sofa cushion next to him. She held out her hands to him, features softening, and Damon eyed her for a moment, contemplating whether she was going to do more harm than good. In the end, he slipped his hand into hers, if only for the hope that whatever she chose to do, it was better than wrenching, searing pain. How long this time? Damon asked as he allowed his sister to rub her fingertips over each throbbing knuckle and alleviate his regular morning affliction. Closing his eyes, head back against the sofa, he hummed. That was good. It was helping. He couldn't ever achieve this type of therapy by himself. He rarely had someone to help. When Kelly didn't immediately answer his question, Damon peeked out of one eye. Kels? She flicked back her hair, eyes wide and full of innocence. She might be old enough to make her own decisions, but it was a shame they were mostly the wrong ones, like the one he was sure was coming his way now. He's moving in, she said. Damon closed his eyes, nostrils flaring. Ding, ding, ding. Fuck's sake, Kels. No need to be like that. Kelly threw back his hand and stood. Damon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Don't do this, he said. He pleaded. He begged, and wasn't sure if it was for himself or for her. You don't need him. You finally got your own flat. So what if it had seen better days and was on the top floor of a block facing the busiest part of the high street, where sirens, drunks, and crying babies prevented real sleep? It was still a roof. Far more than Damon had. What do you know? Kelly snapped. It's not like you can help me with the rent, is it? Damon hefted up from the sofa. At least I'm trying. He grabbed his string bag from by his feet. Unlike him, he's using you, Kels. He's using this flat. Fuck off. She meant it, too. Damon peered into his bag. Where's my sketchbook? I don't bloody know, do I? Kelly peeped out of the net curtain to the front balcony, then added over her shoulder, It's not like you need it anymore, is it? She had a point, but still, ouch. He tugged the strings on his bag and threw it over his shoulder, then glanced around the flat. Nothing belonged to him. Everything he had was in his bag. His chest constricted with having to leave, with having to walk out on Kelly. But it wasn't like he could do anything about it. He'd been given his marching orders, and no matter what, this wasn't his home. You want me to tell Mum where you are? Kelly asked, hints of remorse sifting to the surface. Where would you say I am? Damon cocked his head, considering you've chucked me out of the only place I can go. I don't have a choice, Damo. She softened, big sister tipping over the trapped young woman. He can help pay for stuff, and you've made it clear you don't like him, so I'd rather not the fights under my own roof, thanks very much. By fights, she meant verbal ones, because Damon had lost his physical ability to punch the men who ruined his sister's and mother's lives some time back. At least he'd gotten a few right hooks in when he could. Why don't you go back to Mum's? Kelly said. Damon snorted. That also wasn't an option. Wrapping his hand around the doorknob, he attempted to yank it open, but his fingers cramped, sharp pain shooting to his wrist. Fuck! He hated this. Fucking hated it. Kelly rushed over, and Damon swore she looked ready to cave, ready to invite him back, ready to be a carer for her crippled baby brother. The knock from behind the door sealed his fate. Shit! Kelly glanced over to the old-style mantelpiece clock that had once belonged to their grandmother. He's early. I'm going, so don't panic. That had meant to soothe her, but it came out irritated. Who could blame him? I told him you were never here. Kelly's eyes filled with undeserved fear. Momentarily forgetting about the blistering infliction in each of his joints, he squared his shoulders. So what if he wasn't able to protect his big sister anymore? He wasn't going to be intimidated either. So he opened the door. Harvey was bigger than he remembered. Damon wasn't exactly tall himself. His 5'8" stocky build had worked for him in his teens, but now most towered over him. Harvey didn't just tower, though. He loomed. 6 foot something else, he was built like a brick shithouse and had honed the perfect physique for someone who had to carry off the don't mess with me vibe to his subordinates. And by subordinates, Damon meant those who passed his gear across county lines for him. Damon, Harvey said. Not in greeting, in surprise, in annoyance, in threat. I'm off, Damon said over his shoulder to his sister, then attempted to scoot past Harvey's thick body taking up most of the doorway. If you want to move your arse, that is. Harvey chuckled, deep and rumbling. Damon felt the vibrations rattle through every part of his body. Did Kelly give you money? Harvey asked. Damon shot a look over to his sister. She bit her thumbnail, eyes filling up with fear, and she shook her head enough for him to notice, but not so Harvey did. No, Damon lied. Kelly had. Not much. Enough for breakfast. And he hated that he had to take it. Harvey tucked a hand into his back pocket, fishing out a rolled-up set of banknotes. He licked his finger, flicking through the paper, then dragged out a few, changed his mind, tucked one back into the roll, then handed over 5 20s. Damon glanced at the money. He didn't move, then trailed his gaze to meet Harvey's. Means you won't have to come back for a while. Harvey thrust the money at Damon. Damon glanced back to his sister. She nodded. Damon snatched the notes, then held one up to the sun. It was legit, so he rolled them up, shoved them in his back pocket, and wriggled past Harvey. The front door slammed after his exit, and Damon sighed. One day he'd have enough cash, his own gaff, and a job to support his sister. That day wasn't today, though, and he trundled along the top-floor balcony, tiptoeing past the flat at the end in the hope he wouldn't be heard. He'd cross his fingers if that didn't cause him an inordinate amount of pain and discomfort. He wasn't quiet enough. "Damon!" Amy slipped out of the flat, screams, yells, and crashes following her out. "Weren't going to say goodbye, no?" She dumped her hand on her hip, pink, juicy tracksuit trousers so low he could see the outline of abdominal muscles. She was a stocky girl for a 16-year-old. Damon offered a smile. "Thought you'd be asleep." Poor reply, he knew it. She snorted. "Sure." She then opened the door ajar and pulled out an A4 sketch pad. She handed it over. "You might want this." "How'd you get it?" "Asked Kelly. You're good, you know. Right shame what happened to you. I'd be right mad about it." Damon flicked through the pages of pencil drawings. Most of them were sitting portraits. A few were natural sketches he'd done whilst on the street. Then there were the life drawings he was far prouder of and relieved to have back in his unorthodox portfolio that wouldn't ever get him anywhere. "Been practicing copying your tag." "You shouldn't copy, Ames." Damon shut the pad. "Come up with your own stuff." She shrugged. "Yours is better. Anyway, can I pose for you one day?" She twirled a lock of hair around her finger. "See Picasso in action?" "Picasso did surrealism." "What's that?" "Not what I do." Although lately his out-of-alignment drawings could favour that style without him wanting them to. "Later, James." Damon angled his head toward his sister's flat. "Listen out for Kelly, yeah? If you hear anything that don't sound right, call the police." Amy grimaced. "Ew, ain't calling the filth for no one." She tusked and edged back into the flat. "Don't need that sort here." Damon guessed not, so he waved her off and left. For where? He wasn't sure. Chapter 2. The Thin Blue Jeans. "No idea what this one is, Patrick? Perhaps we need to turn it upside down." The underground station manager shot a confused glance Patrick's way, then attempted to tilt his head enough to mimic standing on it. "Bit tricky, that," he said, giving up and straightening out, considering it's on the side of a building. Patrick nodded and folded his arms. He hummed in deliberation. The smudged artwork, or, more properly considered by its current neighbours, vandalism, sprayed on the side of the tube station entrance wall, certainly looked as though turning it upside down might help decipher what the artist, more commonly known in Patrick's circles as Asbo Magnet, as there were many who had several antisocial behaviour orders to their name in these neck of the woods, wanted to portray in his most recent showpiece. He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. This was the third scene of crime he had been called to in the last week. The graffiti shrouding the many walls of various other council-owned buildings certainly contained a message. It was a shame the compositions had to be painted over, as they weren't particularly bad to look at least in Patrick's opinion. Not that he knew much about art. Stickmen was probably the most he managed, and his standard-issue mini-pencil was mainly used to take written notes. Which reminded him. Fishing out his notepad from his top pocket, he prepared himself for more honest community policing. The tiny pencil tucked into the wired circles could really do with a good sharpen. Too many notes written these past few weeks. Notes, notes, notes. Paperwork, paperwork, paperwork. His mother had been concerned about him becoming a bobby on the beat in an East London neighbourhood. She'd thought, as had he, that he'd be getting into all sorts of scrapes and fisticuffs. She'd feared for the baby boy leaving Tipperary for London and ending up a statistic. No such luck. "Right." Patrick poised his pencil at the ready. "What time did you leave the station last night?" "Midnight." Peter puffed out his chest. "Was back by 6 this morning." Patrick widened his eyes. "That's not much rest time." "Tell me about it, mate," Peter tutted. "Short of staff since all the job cuts. Barely get an hour off these days." Patrick knew all about that. Government budget cuts had affected all the public services, but no one was storming the Houses of Parliament with their amusing cardboard signs to demand more bobbies on the beat, or London tube staff. That was down to the unions. "Any CCTV?" Patrick asked. "Sure," Peter smiled. Patrick slapped his notebook against his thigh. "Now we're getting somewhere." The previous CCTV footage appropriated from the last crime scene at the local Conservative Party meeting house hadn't captured anything of significance about the culprit. All Patrick knew at this point was they were probably after a male, although the atypical hooded top and dark jeans didn't completely rule out a female, but the 5'6" to 8-ish, stocky, and distinctly curved bump of a backside had suggested the culprit was more in the realms of a masculine persuasion. Patrick would rather see a face for full confirmation, though. Would make his job a hell of a lot easier for a start. And he'd stared way too long at an arse legging it away from the building. Way too long. He cleared his throat. "Can I see?" "Nope." Peter's chipper tone was unnerving. "No tape in it. Budget cuts." Peter shrugged. "Of course." Patrick rolled his eyes, then brought his notebook up to continue writing. "So, nothing was seen, heard, no leftover bits of paint." "Pretty much." Peter scratched his head. "Think you'll catch him?" "Oh, no doubt about it." Patrick flipped his notebook shut and wasn't sure if he was coming across as sarcastic as he felt. "If we had the staff, we'd have an officer on the places we'd think he'd target next. There's a definite pattern." "If you had the staff?" "Budget cuts." Patrick tucked his pencil into his top pocket. "I'm about all there is on this one." Peter cocked his head, glancing back to the piece of graffiti defacing the entrance to the tube station. Patrick gazed upon it in idle silence for a moment too, then slipped his phone out from his trouser pocket, set it to camera, and held it up to snap a photo. The iconic click made Peter glance back to him with a frown. "That for evidence?" "Sure," he said. "Evidence. Before you paint over it." "Me? I have to paint over it?" "Unless we catch him and he'll get the community order to clean it up. But likelihood is that won't be for a while, and I'm guessing you don't want that as the welcome to East Park Tube Station." "Surely it's a community building," Peter grumbled, "and you're a community officer." "Community police officer." Peter gave him a look, one that was all too familiar, one that said, "Not a real copper then." "We'll check our community service list," Patrick said. "See if we can get anyone over from the rubbish picking to wash this off." "Good-o." Peter pointed at the wall. "You know, I reckon you tip that sideways a bit and it looks like a load of cocks coming out of a cigarette packet and spurting their load onto a suit." Patrick glanced back to the wall. "You might be right." Peter guffawed and slapped Patrick on the back. "Think he's trying to say suck my cock to the authorities?" "Suck my poisonous but highly addictive cock, perhaps, to the whole bourgeois." Patrick could feel his cheeks flaming. He hated being so fair-skinned. Irish blood, red hair, freckles, and pasty skin. Least he had use of the work gym to keep himself in shape, or he'd also be gangly thin for his 6-foot frame. His distinct looks also meant he would never have got into MI5, even if he'd passed the spy exam. It was his hair, curly and ginger. People spotted him a mile off. He waved his goodbyes to Peter and trudged off down the high street. He stopped at the corner, out of view, and fished out his phone from his pocket. He scrolled through the camera roll and the photo evidence he'd captured from the past week. There was a definite pattern. This artist had a talent, an eye for colour, but, more importantly, a point to prove about the state of government. Rather intelligent, really, for someone deemed a scally. Peering over the road, he noticed an elderly lady teetered along the adjacent zebra crossing toward him, stabbing the potholed concrete with her walking stick. He offered her a smile. Then, hackles raised, caught sight of the oncoming car flying over the hill toward her. Patrick's pulse elevated. She wouldn't get across before that car reached her, and it looked in no way ready or willing to slow down. He rushed forward, but his phone slipped from his hand and, for some unfathomable reason, he attempted to catch his mobile rather than upending the situation before him. Out of nowhere, a man flew past, holding up his hands to the car. Black BMW screeched to a stop, mere inches from the old dear, who was then guided to safety on Patrick's side of the road by the hero of the hour. "Thank you," the lady said, voice shaking as much as Patrick was. "No problem, love." The young man flashed her a dashing smile that seemed to lighten his whole demeanour. "Thought he would have done that." She waved the end of her walking stick in Patrick's general direction. "Sorry, madam." Patrick pocketed his phone and had to tear his gaze from the valiant lad. "I was on my way, but this one got there first." "A good thing we have decent young men in this town, then, like this one." She patted the young man's arm. "What's your name, love?" "Damon." The lad held out his hand to her and she shook it. "Living round here you get used to when the boy racers are going to fly over that hill." "The police should do something about it." "Or the council," Damon said. "Couple of speed bumps would sort that out, or a traffic light on this crossing." "And they can fix that eyesore while they're at it." The woman pointed her walking stick up the high street, and Patrick flicked his gaze back to the tube station entrance, now defaced with giant cock sticks. "Oh, I don't know, love. He's not that much of an eyesore." Damon winked right at Patrick, then stroked back his hair to reveal a cheeky yet ever so chiselled face. "I'd say a fiery delight." Patrick flinched. He couldn't move, nor respond. He fumbled for something to say, but trouble was, he'd never, pretty much never, been called anything of such. Carrot top, ginger snap, freckle face, fire crotch, those were more the norm, but none of those were said with affection. And especially nothing had been said to him while in full PCSO uniform and patrolling the beat. By the time he got hold of his faculties and realized he had a job to perform by aiding the elderly lady and perhaps even reprimanding the driver of the speeding vehicle, everyone had gone. Except the car. "Oi, pig!" The passenger window wound down and out lobbed a drinks can, voice yelling from within. "Do your job and pick that up." Car then sped up, screeching over the roundabout and out of view. Patrick sighed and memorized the registration number. That'll come back to bite the man on the arse. Or perhaps maybe not. The car could be stolen. He supposed he better check rather than thinking about where the hero of the hour had hurried off to. So he flicked on his walkie-talkie and called it in for the real police to take a look. Moments later, the blues and twos whizzed past him, following where the car had gone. Patrick was left to pick up the drinks can and clean the streets. Everyone started on the lowest rung. Everyone. His phone vibrated in his pocket and he dug deep to fish it out. He closed his eyes and wondered whether he could leave it this time. Nope, she would know. So he swiped and held the phone a little way from his ear to answer. "Mom?" "Patrick! Patrick, where are you?" "I'm at work, Mother." Patrick sauntered across the now clear road. Reaching the other side of the high street, he waved at those in the Passage restaurant. The waiting staff inside waved back and held up various items of food through the paned glass window, gesturing for him to come inside. He'd love to. That food was delicious. But he was on duty, something he told those guys time and time again. When in uniform, he couldn't be seen to be taking freebies. "Are you walking the streets?" his mother interrogated with gusto. "Patrolling them, Mother. Patrolling." He could hear her disapproval. She didn't need to have added the tut. Then she said, "We should meet for lunch." Patrick stopped dead in his tracks. He held his breath. "Really?" 12 o'clock. I'll come meet you. Where?" "Okay." He elongated the word. This was unexpected, and he wasn't sure if it was a good thing or not. Maybe he needed to get a better idea for the sudden reach for reconciliation. "Will Dad be coming too? I'll book a table." "Oh, goodness, no. He doesn't even know about this, Carl, so let's go somewhere a bit private. What about that Nando's?" Patrick pinched the bridge of his nose. "Nando's, Mum." The phone clicked off and Patrick pulled it away to check the screen. The bad feeling in his gut had returned. It always did when his mother got in touch. Having been able to surgically remove himself from his parents' sphere of influence some time back, ridding himself of their constant pressure to be someone he wasn't, he shouldn't have answered the phone to allow them back into his life. He'd finally been able to take his first step in the world on his own 2 feet, in a copper's shoes no less. Why had he agreed to allowing his mother to squirm her way inside his head again? Because, no matter what, blood's thicker than water, wasn't it? Chapter 3. Cheeky Nando's. Damon shook out his hand, flexed his fingers, then winced as he had to pull the handle to open the restaurant door. He wasn't disabled enough to ask for a stranger's help. He didn't like to highlight how bad things were. A young, strapping lad like him never got the sympathy vote anyway, especially when it was his hands that swelled. Everyone thought it was self-inflicted from street fights. Perhaps it had been, once upon a time. Except the diagnosis had specified it was hereditary, more likely from the father he didn't know. He shouldered the door open instead and scanned the busy, overcrowded seating area. Boisterously loud as always, the group of lads he was scouting were in the usual spot at the back and 2 chips away from flinging the rest of the food at each other. "Damo!" Tucker, the lesser of the evils in the group, lifted from his seat and waved him over. Damon nodded in acknowledgement and slalomed through the tables to get to him. Fighting off the pain, he clenched his fist into a ball and bumped each of the lads who held out theirs to him. None of them believed he had a real disability, a real affliction, so he saved himself some ag by pretending he didn't. "Park your ass, fella." Tucker scraped a chair from the table behind and slapped the seat. "You eatin'?" "Nah," Damon's stomach growled. "Ate earlier." He needed to save his cash for absolute emergencies. "How's Kells?" "Fine." Damon scaled the chair and sat. "Harvey's back." Tucker widened his eyes. "Like a bad smell, that one." Damon didn't need to say anything to agree. He wasn't here to talk about his sister either. "Listen, Tuck, I can't stay there no more. Can I crash at your gaff for a bit?" Tucker shoved in the last of his burger, chewed, swallowed, then picked up his pint of Coke to slurp through the clinking ice. Slamming it back down on the table, he twisted in his chair to put his back to the rest of the lads. "What happened to that fancy place you had in Central?" "You know I had to give that up." Damon wasn't sure if Tucker would know. He'd thought, on landing the student digs and his place on the prestigious fine art course, that he could leave all this behind, that he could finally live the life he'd been destined for. Except he was back, here, with even less than he'd started with. "They don't let you keep the room if you quit the course." "Shouldn't have quit the fucking course." Tucker slapped Damon's chest. "You were the only one who got out of this stinkhole. Now you're back, fool." "Didn't have much of a choice." Damon rubbed his knuckles. "Bit hard to draw when your hands are fucked." "Don't they do it all on computers anyway?" "Graphics, yeah. That weren't the course I was on." Damon eyed the leftover food the lads had discarded. Knowing it was heading for a skip had Damon's stomach squirming in resentment. He licked his lips. He could reach over and scoff some, fuck what they thought. Risible pride made him not do that. Although, like his prospects and the novelty of sofa surfing, his dignity was waning. Tucker leaned back in his chair, rubbing his no doubt satisfied stomach. "You know you're welcome on my sofa any time, mate, but not tonight." "Your mum?" "Your fucking mum," Tucker cackled. "I fucking wish, right? Should get in line for a revolving door. Who is it this time?" "Fuck you, Tuck." The sting of Tucker's words, and more so the truth in them, cut deep, and Damon couldn't stop the resentment in his returning curse. Luckily, Tucker had known him half his life, and it would wash over him like his need for GCSEs had. "I got lists round tonight," Tucker said. "Mum's buggered off to the Costas with Dick, or for the Dick probably." He rubbed his hands together with glee. "So, house to myself for a week." Damon shuffled up in his seat. A week? That was perfect. He could hang out at Tucker's for a week. He could close his eyes and ears off to him banging his girlfriend. He could source somewhere longer term with a week to play with. He might even be able to find a job, painting something somewhere. If he had an address, he could claim. He'd never been able to use Kelly's address, as she'd lose her single-person status. "I won't get in the way," he said to Tucker with too much of a whine to his voice, knowing he sounded desperate. "Liz won't even know I'm there." "Damo." Tucker dropped a hand on his knee and squeezed. "Liz hates you. She'd smell you in the fucking garden." Damon exhaled, nostrils flaring with their defeat. "Why does she hate me?" Tucker slurped from the dregs in his glass. "'Cause of all that shit, that stuff, innit?" He shrugged, trying ever so hard to come off as nonchalant, when Damon knew it was loaded with so much angst it weighed him down to the ground and could be the reason why he dragged fraying jeans along East London streets. Because, by all that shit, Tucker was referring to him turning down Liss's mate for a no-strings fling, who then discovered his sketchbook filled with drawings of men. Naked men, which preceded his coming out to his mates. Yeah, that had ruffled a few feathers, including Tucker's. Damon wouldn't be here unless he was desperate. "Right." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What about tomorrow night? Can I crash tomorrow night?" "I'll see. She might want another round, you know." Tucker winked before he was hit in the face with a chip. He retaliated by picking up the remnants of his glass of Coke and chucking it at Sol, who jumped from his seat, groin soaked. "Twat." Damon sighed, slamming back in his chair as the fight between his old schoolmates ensued. He rubbed his temple. Yeah, they were all products of their upbringing. Yeah, none of them had any real way out of a situation that had them scouting for work with no qualifications, only to be turned away and forced back to sourcing a form of income any other way they could. That was the hand they had all been dealt. He couldn't blame half of them for who they'd become. Stay in your lane and all that. Damon had been given a different hand, though. A gifted one, once. His talent for art had offered him an escape, but that hand had cramped, seized up, and the early onset arthritis had forced him back here with no help, no support, no chance of anything. Injustice burned in his gut, and his fingers itched to say something about it. He jolted forward at a sudden bump to his back. "Sorry, pardon me." Damon peered up, gazing into bashful blue eyes surrounded by auburn freckled skin that were like stars dotting a blanket of night sky. And that hair, that wavy, fiery red hair had Damon blinking, had him staring, had him awestruck and sweltering. The man was police, though, a community support officer. No way should he be imagining that man posing like one of his life models. "It's okay." Damon smiled up at him. He couldn't not. He had a thing for redheads. It was the colour. It spoke to his aesthetic side. "Twice in one day I'd say you're following me. Should I be worried?" The copper glowed a glorious shade of embarrassment that Damon wanted to mix, match, and paint with. "Not that I know of," the copper said, an ever so slight Irish accent tipping to the surface, as though he'd been here a while, as though watered down with Cockney gringo. Whatever it was sweet and light and like summer birds tweeting in Damon's ear. "You tell me." "It's a fair cop, Gov." Damon slapped his wrists together, holding out his arms to him. "Put the cuffs on me. I'll be your prisoner." He winked. The man shook his head, chuckling away the sentiment that couldn't have been more truth. He then scooted into the booth beside Damon's, removing his hat to allow those glorious ginger locks free. God, it was beautiful. He was beautiful, so striking, such an impressive colour of copper, of fire, of scorching hot flames that had Damon twisting in the seat to face him. The man peeked at him, cautiously. He thought Damon was having him on. He thought Damon was teasing him. Damon would tease him, in all the right ways. "Oi!" Tucker whacked his arm. "You listening?" Reluctantly, Damon twisted back into the conversation.
What? You seen that graffiti on the tube wall? We got our very own Banksy in the village.
Tucker was being facetious with the word village. East Park, East London, was as far from idyllic village life as it could get. It was concrete-clad high-rises meshed with urban social housing, dripping hard living, and a local authority who didn't give a fuck.
Wish it was worth half what a Banksy was,
Damon mumbled.
Why? So you can chisel it off that wall and sell it?
Tucker cackled, slapping Damon on the back. Yeah, exactly that. Damon leaned back in his chair, phasing in and out of the mundane conversation from Tucker and the gang. He peeked over at the copper. Red sat ramrod straight, hands linked on the tabletop, perusing the menu underneath. Every time the door opened, he flicked his gaze toward it. It was a mesmerizing picture. The emotions playing on his face had Damon enraptured. Whoever he was waiting for, he was both anxious and eager. Could be a date. But what PCSO would date in his uniform? And in Nando's? Although, to be fair, Damon would happily chow down on half a lemon and pepper chicken if someone else was paying for it, and there was a promise of licking hot, freckled skin for dessert. Fuck, he needed to get laid. He tuned back into Tucker's conversation, trying to rid images of making copper squeal. He didn't know how long it was, but long enough to know that Red had been stood up. No one had come to meet him. He hadn't ordered any food, and he thanked the waiter, adjusted his hat, then left. Damon hated whoever it was who had dampened that man's glow. Chapter 4. Support in the Community. Patrick slammed his fridge door shut and huffed. There wasn't anything in there that could be considered nutritional or formed into any meal that he wanted to eat right then. The rest of his shift had been the usual stuff, confiscating the alcohol drunk illegally on the streets, preventing those riding their bikes through the town square, chatting with local shop proprietors about their crime prevention methods. He hadn't got any leads on the graffiti artist, and it turned out the driver and owner of the vehicle who'd nearly collided with the elderly woman was the local MP's son. So that wasn't leading to any tick on a box next to his name. And his mother hadn't shown. He'd hated how he'd hoped and hoped and hoped. He hated how gullible he'd been. Would always be. A takeaway it was for the evening. A curry from down the high street would do him nicely. He kept that restaurant open from his recurring visits alone. There wasn't ever anyone in there anymore. Once a thriving restaurant, now it made the majority of its profits from orders via the Deliveroo and Uber Eats apps. But Patrick needed a walk. Even if his job meant that he'd achieve his 10,000 steps by morning, he still preferred to not have to pay the added extra of a delivery fee. He yanked his coat off the hooks by the front door and made the short walk into the high street to grab his usual from the passage to India, scents of tikka masala and onion bhaji making his stomach growl. After throwing the guys a $5 tip, way too much, but anything to help keep something alive in his town, he made his way back home in practical pitch black. The street lighting wasn't working. A hooded figure struggling over by the DIY hardware store caught Patrick's attention. He stopped, squinting through the darkness and pulse elevating. It looked dodgy. Typically, the one time he might catch someone in the act, he only had a curry to arm himself with. "Oi," he called, hoping his presence would scare the culprit off. The figure fell, hard, right onto the concrete and huddled in the corner, groaning. "Oh, God," Patrick gulped. This looked bad. Could it be a stabbing? A heart attack? Checking nothing was flying over the rail bridge and ready to strike him down twice in one day, he bolted across the road to reach the person in trouble. "Hey, you okay?" The man coughed, hissed, sucked in a pained breath, and Patrick edged closer with both trepidation and caution. "Do you need help?" The man twisted, collapsing against the shutters. "Is it withdrawal?" Patrick had to ask. It was in his training, and this had all the hallmarks of someone needing something he didn't have. Dark eyes fell on Patrick, and there was a flicker of recognition within them. Eyes bloodshot, wincing in pain, and face pale. He looked beaten. Is it withdrawal? Patrick had to ask. It was in his training, and this had all the hallmarks of someone needing something he didn't have. Dark eyes fell on Patrick, and there was a flicker of recognition within them. Not only recognition, revelation. And relief.
No.
The lad's voice was tight, as though it pained him to speak.
Psoriatic arthritis, if you must know.
Arthritis? Patrick crouched, checking the man's face. How old are you?
Why? You're going to call my mum, tell her to come collect me. Wouldn't bother me. She wouldn't answer. Wouldn't care. Never has.
Damon. The name fell from Patrick's lips as if it had been lingering there all day. It had. The man, was stunning, smouldering and mysterious, tough and foreboding, yet with a vulnerability seeping from his solid, broad frame, the complete opposite from him.
That's right.
Damon slipped to sit against the wall.
About time I knew your name then, before I start calling you Red.
Patrick.
Patrick.
Damon breathed out his name as though testing how it tasted on his tongue.
Nice.
Isn't arthritis usually an older person's affliction?
Common misconception.
Damon winced, swollen palm splayed on the pavement.
And the killer of dreams.
Behind the physical pain, Patrick noted the anguish that seemed to cut him deep. He couldn't help his immediate instinct to help. It's why he'd gone into community policing in the first place. Not to clean up rubbish and eyesores sprayed on the side of community walls, but to be the calming presence and help to those in need. Do you have medication? Can I help you get home somehow? Damon glanced away, and the look of shame had Patrick falling away. He eyed him more clearly now, the overstuffed string bag at his feet, the tatty clothes with splatter marks of Patrick wasn't sure what, the telltale signs of someone who hadn't had a warm shower in a while. Patrick had been a community support officer in this town a couple of years and could recognize when someone was down on their luck. There were so many of them in this forgotten part of East London who were. So he rephrased his question. Do you have somewhere to go? Damon met his gaze. He didn't nod nor shake his head. He stared, vacantly, as though contemplating what to say, what to admit, how much he could trust him. So the lad wasn't a regular street kid then. Most of those offered up the information straight away, to garner sympathy and the possible hope that they could be given money, food, the advice of a vacant shelter. Family? Patrick probed cautiously. Damon shook his head. Friends. Perhaps the lad was from Care. He looked around the age the system spat them out and made them fend for themselves. So cruelly, as if, by hitting the age of 18, Care kids no longer needed support, could fend for themselves, and simply passed on to another service in the community. Many were then lost in the paper trail, only to turn up years later on some other community service. Many were unjustifiably on Patrick's restorative justice list.
I have friends.
Damon's snap signified that statement might not have been strictly truthful. Patrick understood. Friend was such a relative word. People could have friends, acquaintances perhaps, that one could surround themselves with during the day when life was all rosy. But come night and troubled times, those friends could become rather distant, like those lads he'd been sitting with at lunchtime. Do you need me to call anyone, to come and get you, help you home?
I don't have a home, all right?
Damon hung his head.
Not tonight, anyway.
Patrick had been trained not to let his feelings cloud his judgment. He found it hard in this situation, though. A young man, clearly in pain, on the street, with nowhere to go and no one to help him. Gripping the handles on the plastic carrier bag of food, Patrick contemplated his next suggestion, curry smell drifting out from cardboard containers to stir his hunger pangs. No doubt Damon's too.
I saw you earlier at Nando's.
So?
Could any of those you were with offer you somewhere to stay, if it's only for one night?
Damon snorted.
You think I'd be here if they could?
Good point.
Listen, Patrick.
Damon shifted to raise himself against the shop shutters.
It's fine. This ain't the first time I've had to spend the night on a bench, nor will it be the last. Don't think you need to help or call anyone. Shift me along if you have to, but give me a sec, yeah?
What about a hostel? YMCA offer rooms last minute. I could get their number. Patrick dropped the bag to the ground to fish out his phone from his jeans pocket. It wasn't there. He'd left it charging at home. Damon reached out a hand to stop him, then whipped it back with a fierce wince.
Fuck!
He banged his head against the shutters, the clang as loud as crackling thunder.
Let me get you some painkillers.
Patrick nodded over to the whooshing open doors of the Tesco Metro on the corner.
They don't help.
What does?
Rest. Not being a stupid dickhead by using my hands. Massage.
Patrick shot another glance over his shoulder. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe a night shift PCSO to take on the responsibility of this young man. There weren't any in sight. Budget cuts. Less bobbies on the beat, especially at night. He sighed, brow crinkling. What could he do here? What could he reasonably do?
It's all right, mate, Damon said, gaze focusing on him. I'll wait out the pain and move on when I can. Won't clutter the place too long to make it look untidy. I think we ought to get you to a hostel. I don't have the money for that. You won't need it. I'll call it in.
Patrick bit his lip. He could if he hadn't left his phone at home. And he'd offer the man the few quid it would cost to have one night in a bed, but that was against PCSO policy. If it was discovered he'd aided one person off the street with his own cash, then the department would be inundated by others demanding the same. Damon whimpered. Patrick hadn't ever heard a sound like it, certainly not coming from a strapping lad like Damon. Perhaps a puppy or a child. The sound broke Patrick's resolve and all his professional training. He took off his metaphorical hat, wriggled free of the restraints of his blue band vest, and took this moment for what it was, helping someone in need.
I live over there.
Patrick pointed up from the high street.
My phone is there. I'll call the local hostels or a hotel. They'll be somewhere.
Damon heaved in a harried breath, nostrils flaring.
You don't have to do that.
I want to do that. Patrick was about to tell him to stay put, that he'd be back with the news and would wait with him until the authorities turned up. But the sudden, boisterous cries from a large group bustling out of the tube station at the top of the hill highlighted how vulnerable Damon was lying there. With no way to defend himself, he could lose the limited possessions he had. He was a sitting duck, ready and waiting for someone to take advantage in whatever way they saw fit. Maybe it was his training. Maybe it was his innate need to better things. Maybe it was his ingrained yearning to improve things for those who didn't have the privilege he did. Or maybe it was mellow, coffee-coloured eyes gazing upon him as though he were a saviour. Whatever it was, it made Patrick say, "Come with me. Wait at my place until we find you somewhere." Damon narrowed his eyes.
How do I know you're legit?
Patrick tapped his pockets, found his ID card and ripped it out. He showed his badge number, along with the embarrassing photograph when he'd been so ridiculously happy that he'd made it in the Met.
Patrick Connors, PCSO. You can hang on to it for a safety check. I realise it isn't a confirmation that I'm not a crazed opportunistic murderer of vulnerable men in doorways, but it's something to offer should you be concerned.
Damon arched an eyebrow.
Should I be concerned?
About me murdering you? No. Not only would I lose my job for that sort of thing, it might also put me off my dinner. Patrick waggled the bag.
You could eat first.
So how about I promise not to eat until after you've gone?
Couldn't ask you to do that.
Damon inhaled, lips curving into a smile.
That stuff smells too good to be left till it's cold. Then how about we share it? Enough in here for two. Probably four, to be honest. They always give me extra. But then that would leave you free to carve me up into little pieces and dump my remains in the recycling. I'd be fine for that. They don't accept body flesh in those orange bags, you know. They wouldn't even take mine the other day when I hadn't washed out my tin of beans.
Damon gasped, then tutted and shook his head with a wry smile.
Save the planet, PC Patrick. Then come help me save the planet by not letting any of this go to waste.
Damon sucked in his bottom lip, then popped it back out. Those lips were soft and warm and inviting and so very kissable. Patrick had to look away from tracing the strawberry-shaped lines before his overbeating heart gave any indication that he wasn't a stalking predator.
All right, Patrick, Damon said, then attempted to stand. Take me home.
Patrick stood, waiting for Damon to heft himself from the ground, but he stumbled, and Patrick used his free hand to grab him and hold him steady. Warm breath floated into his face as Damon exhaled his frustration. Then he was in front of him, looking at him, gazing into his eyes as he shook his head.
Freckles, he said, always falling at the feet of men with freckles.
Chapter 5. Housebound. Damon wasn't sure what he was playing at. Well, he did. He was using what he had to get him a roof and some possible pain relief for the night. The fact it came with fiery hair and freckles was an added bonus. The downside? He was a copper, a community service copper. Him and police shouldn't mingle. Patrick let him into his house, kicked off his shoes to join the pile gathered in the porch, and Damon copied, because he might be homeless, but he had manners. Then Patrick waved him through a frosted glass door that led into the main living space. It was small, not like his sister's flat small, but for an end terrace it was cosy. A living space and kitchen downstairs, with open tread stairs leading to the first floor.
Nice gaff,
Damon said, taking in the knickknacks to get a feel for who Patrick was on his days off. Patrick's elevated eyebrows suggested he thought Damon was taking the piss. He wasn't. He'd chew his right arm off to have a place like this. At least that would relieve the pain in his fingers. But although the place was perhaps a little run down, could use a refurbish, a paint job, integration of some decent artwork and fancy decor, it was a palace compared to where he spent most of his nights.
Seriously, mate, I've stayed in a hell of a lot worse.
Patrick meandered into the kitchen, clanging around for plates and cutlery. Damon followed him, leaning against the doorframe to watch. He waited a while, wondering how long it would take. Judging from the stiffness in Red's shoulders, he knew it wouldn't be long.
How did it happen? Me being trampy hobo. I don't think we call it that anymore.
Patrick didn't look at him as he spooned out the curry and rice onto 2 plates.
The world gone all PC on the homeless now too. What are we, shelter challenged?
Patrick let out a slight laugh before turning serious.
How did you come to be living on the streets?
Damon smiled. Patrick was sweet. Too sweet, with a bitter aftertaste. His hair, his freckles, he bet they tasted like strawberries, or those cherry tang fastics. One lick and his taste buds would explode, yet want to dive right back in until his tongue swelled. Why was it he had a thing for gingers?
Long story,
he said, fighting the urge to inhale the waves of bronzy red hair. Patrick handed over a plate piled high with food. Damon arched an eyebrow. Patrick had given him way too much, if not most of it.
That's good.
Patrick nodded at the plate.
Jam-packed full of calories, but it doesn't look like that's a problem for you.
Damon could tell he was fighting the need to rake his gaze down him. Yeah, okay, he was a strapping lad, short but stocky. He'd kept himself in shape when he'd been able to use the uni gym. He wasn't all muscle, but he wasn't all flab either. And Patrick was checking him out. Actually checking him out, or trying very damn hard not to show that he was. Damon smiled, grinned, smirked. What I mean is, you need this more than me. Patrick handed over a spoon and angled his head toward the living space. Damon followed him out, and they sat either end of the sofa, plates resting on their knees, hot porcelain pinching through Damon's jeans to his leg. Patrick dived right in, and Damon watched him for a moment, undecided how to go about this. "You don't like Indian food?" Patrick asked, shoveling the food to the side of his cheek. "Yeah." Damon hesitated through the embarrassment, then his stomach growled to add into the mix of it all. "What's wrong?" Patrick hovered his fork at his lips. "I promise I've not poisoned it. You saw me dish it out." "Yeah, I know." Damon inhaled a sharp breath. He needed to get this over with. So he gathered up his fork and spoon, wrapped his fingers around them, then tried to scoop it up. His knuckles tightened, pain seared through his fingers, up his wrist, and darted along his arm, and he dropped the spoon, rice grains falling onto the shag pile carpet and masala sauce staining the fibers. "Shit, sorry." Damon bent down to try and pick it up. Patrick waved him off. "No worries. Don't move." He propped his plate on the side of the couch, then slid off to pick up the spoon. As he slipped back onto the cushions, he held it out to Damon. "Is it difficult to eat? With the hands?" "Can be." Damon slumped his head back onto the sofa, waiting for the pain to subside. It sometimes did. Most of the time he could be oblivious to his infliction. One moment he could be sketching his best work to date, pencil strokes gliding across a page and creating a piece of art, only to have his fingers swell and he'd score a line or smudge through the sketch without warning. Patrick sat back beside him. He went quiet. Like most people, he had no idea what to do. "I'll be all right." Why was it he always had to do the reassurance? When would someone tell him it would be all right? Never. Because it wasn't. He'd lost his future, his home, and the hope that anything would ever be all right again. Patrick looked like he had lost his appetite as he was staring down at his plate, not moving. So, like a real trooper, Damon picked up his fork and ate through the sting. After a while, Patrick copied him, and that, for some reason, warmed Damon's heart more than tikka masala. Once he'd got through enough to ease his stomach pangs, Damon dropped the cutlery onto the plate and sat back. "You were right," he said. "That was really good." Patrick smiled, nodded, then took Damon's plate from him and cleared them into the kitchen. When he returned, hovering at the separating border, he still didn't say anything. Silence had filled the air like a balloon ready to pop. Damon found his mouth was speaking before he'd even realized. "My mum chucked me out. When I was 18, she got a new fella and he, well, didn't like my lifestyle choices." "Lifestyle choices? As in?" Damon smiled. God, the guy was cute. "Gay." Patrick's cheeks flamed gloriously. "Oh, I see." He couldn't look at him. He looked anywhere but at him. Except it wasn't in that disgusted, disapproving way that his mates had, that his mates' girlfriends had, that his mum's new piece had. It was in a way that said, "Me too, but I've never said it." So Damon skirted over the issue to add, "I didn't care that she chucked me out 'cause then I had a place at Central St. Martin's." Patrick did look at him then, eyes wide. "The Art University?" "Yeah, lived in halls for a couple of years, but this," Damon held up his hands, "stopped me from completing, stopped me from turning up to class, was chucked out of halls for no-show and sent home, except I didn't have a home. Have to pay back the loans and bursaries somehow too. Been sofa hopping since. Mainly at my sister's, but she's intent on making all the same mistakes my mum did, so..." Damon shuffled in his seat. "Here I am." Patrick tucked his hands into his trouser pockets. "Couldn't you get help? From the university, I mean. It's hardly your fault." "Met with welfare.
They offered to transfer me to a different course as I couldn't complete the fine art degree, but, to be honest, I didn't want to. I'm not cut out for anything else.
Patrick's exhalation was fierce, as though he couldn't understand. Whether that was understanding Damon's predicament or how the university had dealt with him, he wasn't sure. Damon knew he'd brought most of this on himself. He could have transferred. He could have tried something different. But he was mad, so infuriated that the only thing he wanted to do had been ripped from him. So he'd resorted to showing how pissed off he was about that.
You'd be entitled to DLA,
Patrick muttered through the air.
Sure, but I don't have a fixed address. Without a fixed address, I can't get benefits.
Your sister's address?
And have Harvey steal the check.
He probably shouldn't have said that, so he quickly changed the subject.
Been a copper long?
PCSO.
Same thing, innit?
Not really. I don't have the power to arrest people. I don't have much power at all. I'm more a friendly presence in the community, offering support and dealing with misdemeanors.
Yeah? Like what?
Patrick sighed. Mainly, at the moment, community eyesores.
Rubbish and that.
Antisocial behaviour.
Got your work cut out for you round here then?
Patrick didn't say he agreed, but Damon could tell in the way he breathed out a despondent chuckle. Then he went serious. I'm sorry about your family. I understand a little about that sort of thing. Damon leaned forward, all ears, all eyes, all attention for Freckles.
Yeah?
Here was the confession.
Don't you like being a copper?
Not exactly. I wasn't chucked out, per se. It was simply agreed by all that it would be better if I no longer resided with them. But yes, they would prefer I was a detective rather than a hobby-bobby.
Why aren't you?
I didn't do so well at school. I have to start on the lowest rung of the ladder, work my way up. Damon nodded. The bloke didn't look like he'd been a mess about. He seemed rather intelligent behind the timidness. Damon could tell by the way he spoke. He was masking an Irish accent with his standard English, but no one can ever tell what goes on behind the closed doors of another.
School ain't a good place for everyone,
Damon said. True. I probably could have done well, but I let the bullies get the better of me. Patrick shrugged. It's why I chose to do this, to show that I won't be pushed around again.
Kids are assholes.
Patrick snorted. So, too, are many adults. Damon could feel the undertone of anguish in that statement, and he'd have high-fived or fist-bumped the bloke if it wouldn't cause him outright pain to do so. Patrick ruffled a hand through his wavy ginger hair, stroking it back from his face, and it gave Damon the chance to check him out, properly, as he would do a potential life model. He had a sweet face, like purity. He seemed so out of place being a copper, or PCSO, whatever. His blue eyes, surrounded by thick, curly lashes, gave him doll-like vibes. Not feminine as such, more that he was seeing something for the first time. Damon tilted his head, wondering what that could be. Him? One of his eyes slanted to the right, and Damon finally noticed an ever-so-subtle squint, and it gripped him, squeezed him, urged him to paint it. Patrick wasn't symmetrical. He was off-kilter, wonky, and that had Damon's fingers itching. So, Patrick waved over to beneath the staircase where a mobile sat charging on the desk. Damon suddenly realized he'd been staring all that time. He'd been sketching the man in his mind. He'd been creating the perfect piece of artwork. No smudges. If only. He then watched with a heavy sinking in his gut as Patrick picked up his phone and set it to his ear. He waited a while, tapping his leg, worrying on his bottom lip, and Damon was close to dealing with the pain of crossing his fingers in the hope no one answered. His prayers, for once, were answered when Patrick cut the call. Must be busy, he said, chewing on his bottom lip.
No worries.
This isn't exactly a 999 call.
It's okay.
Damon went to heft up. Stomach filled, he could roam the streets until morning. Then Patrick held up a hand to stop him. "Wait, I said I'd help." He scrolled through his phone, hit call, and waited. "Oh yes, hello. Patrick Connors, PCSO for East Park Constabulary. I have a young man here needing a room for one night." "Yes. Yes." "Really?" Damon peered through lowered lashes, trying not to eavesdrop or jump for joy at Patrick's drooping shoulders. He rubbed each knuckle on his right hand, easing the swelling, and wished he could be easing that tension on Patrick's shoulders. That was the biggest shame of all. "No. Well, not really. I don't quite understand." Patrick flinched, obviously taken aback by whatever they were saying on the other end. Damon assumed it was the usual spiel of no room at the inn. "I thought that a hostel such as yourselves were here to offer those in need a little help. I had no idea you were so blatantly prejudiced. Of course I understand the women's refuge point of view, but this young man needs support as much as—" "Yes. Yes. Connors, yes. PCSO Patrick Connors." Patrick pulled the phone away from his ear. "That was rude. Women's night." "Yeah." Patrick threw his phone on the table. "I mean, they can close the doors. All the rooms are separated with locks should they be worried that one man would break in and—" "Patrick." "Yes." "Thank you for what you've done and are doing, but it's fine." Damon couldn't help but smile. The worry lines crossing Patrick's forehead meshed with his freckles, and his red eyebrows drew in. It was such a picture, a beautiful picture. "This world is crazy." Patrick stepped over Damon's feet to fall back on the other end of the sofa. "True that." Damon stood, legs wobbling from beneath him. He was tired. Lethargy always crept up on him after having to conceal his pain for so long. Come night, he was a wreck. "Can I use your bathroom? Then I'll head on out." Patrick stood, cupping Damon's elbow to steady him. He must have been woozier than he thought. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, no, fine." Damon squared his shoulders. "The pain can make me tired. Exhausted, really, so I should go find somewhere to rest." Patrick stepped back, scrubbing a hand along his chin. He looked troubled, positively adorable too, as though wrestling with himself and his judgment. "I can't let you wander off to nowhere." "You can and you have to. You've done enough already." There was a pause, a large inhale, a flutter of red eyelashes before Patrick settled his gaze on Damon and said, "Stay here." "What?" Damon breathed out a laugh. "I can't. You can't." "Why not?" "I'm a stranger. How can you invite me to stay? Inviting me in your house to share a takeaway was bad enough. You have no idea what I could do to you." Damon swallowed, because he really didn't have any idea what he would do to freckled skin. He yearned to find out if the collar matched the cuffs, if the stars sprinkled his entire body, if he looked as magnificent without his clothes as Damon imagined he would. Patrick blinked. Then those strawberry-tasting lips curved upwards and wrenched right into Damon's soul when he said, "I think I can handle myself." Damon cocked his head, biting down on his bottom lip. God, he really fucking hoped so, because he wasn't sure he could handle himself right then. Chapter 6. Life Model. No, Patrick didn't know what he was playing at. What he did know was that he couldn't allow a man in pain to go back out on the streets. What sort of person would he be then? He'd be as bad as everyone else who ignored the problems outside their door. It had absolutely nothing to do with the twinkle in the man's eye. Nothing whatsoever. "You can stay until you feel better," he suggested, in case he was coming across like he was inviting the man to move in. He had considered getting a lodger for the spare room, but preferably one who could contribute to the rent and wasn't just a nice sight to come home to. Oh God, it was happening again. "Not sure how long that'll be, mate, so it's best if I go now. I don't want to cause you any ag." Damon went to walk away, but Patrick gripped his arm and wasn't sure why he was so desperate.
I can't let you walk out, not without knowing you've got somewhere to go.
I haven't.
Then stay here. It's no ag.
The word felt strange on his tongue, and he laughed it off to save his embarrassment.
If it's for one night, I'm willing to let you have my spare room. Tomorrow, we can find you somewhere else, get you the help you need.
Is this what they teach you at police school?
What?
How to sniff out whether you can trust someone. You don't even know me.
Okay.
Patrick sat and tapped the cushion beside him.
Let's start with that. Get to know each other. Then I'll decide if I can allow you in my home, and you can decide whether you feel safe and comfortable here.
You know I could lie, right?
I have had training for that.
Damon chewed the inside of his cheek and, after what Patrick assumed was a brief internal contemplation, he sat beside him, thighs brushing his, and sense of masculinity probing Patrick's dormancy. He'd spent so long, too long, denying what was there, that he was like this, that he could control his urges, or at least that's what he'd tried convincing his Catholic parents every time they'd marched him to confession. When the threat of conversion therapy had become a distinct possibility, Patrick had learned how to bury, how to crush, how to stamp out any bubbles of desire rippling to the surface and revealing who he really was, a man who so desperately wanted to touch another man and for another man to touch him. Was that so bad? So wrong? Sinful? How could it be when it consumed Patrick like starvation? Good. Patrick cleared his throat, desperately trying to mask his reactions to Damon's proximity. He could do this. He could bury it. He could shove it so far deep in his gut he'd have permanent indigestion. Wasn't that what he was supposed to do? So, mundane conversation it was.
You're an artist.
Yeah, well, was I guess. These days just in my head.
What sort of art?
Fine stuff. Life drawings. Did a bit of sculpting and installation at uni. Won an award for my depiction of a wasteful culture. Was a giant cock. Damon laughed. You know, people en masse are dicks. Patrick snorted.
I guess they are. Sounds impressive, though. I can barely draw a stick man.
That's about all I can manage these days, too.
When did it start? The symptoms, I mean.
Damon sighed, and Patrick hated the look of anguish that spread. For someone so young, with his life ahead of him, to have his passion and potential career path ripped from beneath him through no fault of his own was heartbreaking. "Couple years back," Damon said. "First year at art college, I'd developed itchy, sore skin on my hands. Thought maybe it was the toxins in the paint or something like that. It got worse. Flaky skin on my scalp, too." Damon scratched the back of his neck, and that movement had pheromones sweeping under Patrick's nostrils, not letting him forget what he'd been trying to for years. "Then my hands would swell if I overused them. The pain got worse. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't draw. As that was what I did most of the day, I had to figure out what the fuck was going on. I earned a bit of money on the South Bank doing portraits in my spare time, so it was fucking all that up too. Few tests and the doc told me what it was. No cure, could get worse. It is. Had no choice but to quit."
Couldn't the university have offered some sort of support for you?
Damon laughed. "Like what? Get someone to do my drawing for me? Kinda beats the purpose, don't you think?" Patrick shook his head.
Of course. Sorry. It seems so spectacularly unfair, though.
Damon shrugged. "It is what it is. At the moment it's manageable if I lay off overuse, but come the future, who knows? Makes it hard to plan. What sort of job is there for a bloke who can't function through the pain and whose only skill is drawing nudes?" Patrick jolted at that.
"Nudes?"
"Yeah," Damon chuckled. "Life drawings tend to mean naked, as the day you were born."
"Why nudes?"
Damon shrugged. "The human body is a complex object. Capturing subtle movements from a live model can help convey emotion in the final piece. It's cathartic, meditating, stripping free of constraints and seeing." Patrick widened his eyes. He hadn't realized there was such hidden depth to this man from the street. He could feel the passion, the love, the desire to create, the need to depict what he saw. Having spent so long trying to suppress his feelings, it was novel for someone to be so open, so honest, so stripped bare. I always wonder what sort of woman would shed their clothes and stand there hours on end to be scrutinized. They're not being scrutinized. They're being drawn, materialized. What we see is a depiction of what they emit in their pose. Stella must be terrifying. Do you get many women posing for that sort of thing at university? Sure. They get a bit of cash to sit there and pose. Men, too. I kind of prefer the male form. Here. Damon bent down, rifling through the string bag at his feet, then produced a sketchbook. Take a look. Patrick took the pad with shaking fingers. He shuffled in his seat, clicking his neck from side to side. Then, after a heady inhale, he opened the book. Lips parting, he flicked through pages and pages of stunning artwork. He widened his eyes, pencil drawings of naked men in various poses causing him to blush. They were beautiful. All of them. From the rough, sketched outlines to the shaded and captured emotions bursting from the page, had Patrick in awe. They were so romantic, so natural, so perfectly drawn and artistically idealized, even Patrick could see the talent. He twisted the pad, swallowing hard, eyes focusing on the soft appendage of another man, a man who had posed in front of Damon, bearing all. You'd make a great subject. Damon's soft voice ripped him to the present. Me? Patrick laughed at the absurdity. Yeah. Damon met his gaze, a twinkle in his eye and a smile creeping up his lips. I'm afraid under this is not model material. Patrick indicated his clothes, where beneath the material lay the body he despised. Life drawings find the imperfections and make them shine. Damon stroked a finger along Patrick's cheek. I'd kill to draw your sprinkles. Tell me they're everywhere. Patrick held his gaze for a moment, awestruck. Mouth dry, heart rampant, his cock tweaking and tingling. He could hardly breathe at the intimacy, at the words, at the indication. He stood, handing back the sketchbook. Would you like to use the bathroom? He closed his eyes, cursing himself for the fool he was. The bathroom, the fucking bathroom? What would that suggest to Damon? That he stank? That Patrick didn't want him near him? That he should go wash that dirty, foul mouth out with soap and water? Was he his mother? Had his father entombed himself so far under his skin that 5 years' estrangement hadn't allowed for him to shed the suffocating disapproval? Damon dropped the sketch pad into his bag, then sat back, staring up at him. He exhaled, long and weary, then nodded. Sure. Thanks. It's the door straight at the top of the stairs. Patrick waved a hand in the general direction. Towel's in there. You can shower, or bathe, or rinse off. Spare toothbrush in the pot too. Unopened. Shut the fuck up. Damon nodded his thanks and trudged up the stairs. Patrick stared after him for a moment, taking in the perfect curvature of the man's backside, of watching his hips glide from side to side as he took each step, of his arse, strained against denim and as inviting as a juicy apple. He flicked his gaze away, raking a hand through his hair. There were more reasons than sin to refrain from thinking, feeling what he did. Damon was a young man in a vulnerable position. He was a police officer. He was everything his parents had told him he was. Dirty, filthy, unnatural. He fell onto the sofa, head in his hands. He bashed his temples. No, he wasn't any of those things. He had come to terms with that. He had dug deep, soul-searched, realized it wasn't him who was wrong, dusted himself off to start again. Start new, be him. No, he hadn't taken the biggest step into his newfound acceptance yet. But he could. He wanted to. The whoosh from the shower and splats of spray against the plastic curtain made Patrick peer up the stairs. There was a naked man in his shower, a rather wonderful, sentimental, artistic and beautiful man washing his body in his shower. Patrick could imagine the droplets gliding through each muscle definition, over rounded and pert nipples, sliding into juicy, firm buttocks, clinging to pubic hair. Patrick stood and paced, Dick straining against his standard-wear rough cotton trousers. Feck. He had to think of something else. Anything else. Years and years of living under his exceptionally conservative parents' roof wasn't helping him now. Those moments of having to recite the Bible, having to pretend to Father Jacobs that he hadn't had any sinful thoughts, regardless of what his mother had found on his computer, under his bed, on his phone. None of it worked when he had temptation incarnate already hot, wet, and naked in his bathroom. The shower switched off, door clicking open. "Patrick?" Damon called from upstairs. "Yes." Patrick didn't move, pulse racing and skin on fire. "There was a leak in your shower curtain. My gear's soaked." Fuck. He should have told him he needed to tuck the corner of that plastic curtain into the bath or the shower would leak. "Oh, sorry. I got a towel, but—" The pause indicated Damon was struggling to admit what he had to. Patrick hovered at the bottom of the stairs and glanced up. He wished he hadn't. He couldn't back away now, and instead had to drink in the sight of Damon, small towel wrapped around his waist, but other than that, totally, completely naked and soaking, steam fizzing off his shoulders. Patrick trailed his gaze over the man, finding tattooed stars swirling around his belly button and a few dotted along his arm. It was artwork, beautiful, painted artwork on glorious, taut skin. If Patrick took one step, he'd be able to see up that towel. Did he want to? Did Damon want him to? "My other stuff is at the laundrette. Left it there, said I'd collect tomorrow." Damon flicked back his wet hair, and Patrick hadn't realized quite how hard his dick could get. It was practically explosive. "Right," he strangled out, his brain not functioning enough to connect the dots of what Damon was saying. "Would you happen to have any spare clothes? Joggers, at least," Damon said. "Of course." Patrick shook himself out of his stupor. "Yes. Sorry. I'll, He clambered up the stairs and had to close his eyes as he reached the top, almost chest to chest with Damon. He held his breath, then nodded his head to the bedroom behind. Damon moved ever so slightly, and Patrick had to brush his shoulder with his as he rushed into his bedroom, rifling through his drawers to produce an old pair of running joggers. He held them up. Thinking they might fit the more strapping Damon, he twisted and threw them over to him. "Here." Damon caught them, checked them, smiled. "Thanks." He then, right there in front of Patrick, no warning, no hesitation, no shame, whipped off his towel. Chapter 7. What Lies Beneath. Patrick stumbled back, bashing against his wardrobe so that the door clanged. His heart thumped, his body trembled, his internal thermometer burst. Damon peered over to him beneath knowing lashes as he stepped each leg into the joggers. As he straightened to pull them up, Patrick couldn't stop his gaze from landing on the lustrous cock and balls that were more than an ample handful. He licked his lips and didn't stop staring until Damon shielded them and his arse with the grey jogging bottoms, adjusting the elastic to make them fit. Only then did Patrick inhale, gaze tracing the black stars that circled Damon's stomach and around his belly button. "You okay?" Damon's voice was light, and he tied the strings on the joggers. Patrick managed to force his gaze upright. He cleared his throat. "The tattoos." He pointed rather savagely. "Did you draw them?" What a stupid fucking question. They were stars.
The tattoo artist did.
He then showed his arms.
I designed these and he traced them.
He glanced back to Patrick.
You got any?
Patrick shook his head.
I often wonder what would happen if I let them do a dot-to-dot on the freckles, what it would reveal.
Damon smiled.
I'm game for that.
Patrick couldn't say anything, so Damon glanced to the carpet, then back up, and it was as though something clicked. Something changed, as though he covered something up inside himself to say,
It's okay.
What is?
I'm used to it. So, if you want, I can...
He trailed off the more he stared over at Patrick, as though his confidence in what he was saying diminished with every moment Patrick gaped at him in confusion. Then, out of nowhere, he said,
Blow you?
Patrick balked.
What? In exchange, Damon rushed out, for the room. Is that what you think? It's what I know, from experience. You give blowjobs for a roof over your head. I have done, yeah. And the way you were looking at me.
Damon, Patrick pinched the bridge of his nose.
I'm afraid that perhaps we may have miscommunicated.
Damon stepped forward, a hair's breadth away from Patrick. He cocked his head.
You sure about that? 'Cause it's honestly fine. I'd blow you for nothing. You have no idea how many of my buttons you press. And with that look you gave me, I'd say I'm pressing yours.
I don't need you to do anything. Patrick wasn't sure he believed his own lie, but he had to make things clear here.
I'm deeply concerned that you feel the need to offer that to me, to anyone, for a roof over your head.
Damon stepped back, and Patrick witnessed the shame in his eyes. He no doubt hadn't expected Patrick to back off. Maybe no one had before.
How often do you... I ain't no whore, Damon cut him off. I'm just saying, sometimes I don't mind. Works both ways. I thought that's what you wanted. But perhaps too shy to say it outright. Was letting you know that it's fine.
There's a vast difference between finding someone attractive and wanting them to offer themselves as monetary value. Patrick's exhalation calmed his tumultuous heartbeat. What he thought had been mutual attraction had been confirmed as Damon believing he had to do something for this random act of kindness. He felt wretched. Damon stepped forward again, curling a finger under Patrick's chin to lift his face, and met his gaze. Stunned, Patrick did nothing. He'd already gone too far. He should never have allowed this man into his home, into the secrets he'd kept buried, into his shame.
Sorry.
Damon's cool, minty breath trickled onto Patrick's cheeks.
I didn't mean to offend you, but you are so fucking cute.
Patrick couldn't remember the last time he'd been touched by someone else, even if just with a thumb. Perhaps that was because he never had been. Attempting to tear his eyes from the dark orbs that sparkled back at him, Patrick found that he couldn't. He shivered and remained fixated on the stranger in front of him. The man was like a siren, calling and seeking out Patrick's hidden depths, the parts of Patrick he didn't allow out, that his upbringing hadn't allowed for him to entertain.
I ain't used to people being nice for no reason or for no personal gain.
Damon bowed his head.
And when they're as enticing as you, I act on it. Sorry.
Patrick drained cold as Damon's warmth faded. He couldn't respond to any of those throwaway comments. They meant nothing. They were teasing and probing and baiting. That's all they were. A man desperate and using what he could.
I'll go.
Damon gathered his clothes from the floor. Impulse had Patrick grabbing Damon's wrist and squeezing.
Stay. You sure? Yes, but I expect nothing. You understand that? I don't do it often.
Patrick held his gaze.
You shouldn't have to do it at all.
Damon nodded.
I know.
How did this even start? Damon hovered to the edge of Patrick's bed, and he sat, heavily, shoulders drooping and head bowing. He twiddled his thumbs, and Patrick believed he might be seeing the real Damon, the one who carried the burden, the one who'd been wronged, the one who'd been spat out and discarded.
Rent in central London, even in student digs, is expensive.
Damon peered up, chest rising.
I used to sell my prints, do sketches down the South Bank. I did all right. Then this happened.
He held up his hand with a deep growl.
So I moved on to street art.
Street art?
Yeah, like graffiti. Artistic graffiti.
Damon smiled.
Not the shitty eyesores you get round here.
Patrick frowned.
How does that bring you money? It didn't at first. Then I got picked up by these people, wanted me to paint murals on places, brighten community buildings, cash in hand, that sort of thing, so I did.
Patrick sat beside him. A dull and fearful ache pounded at his temple.
What sort of murals? Oh, usually something like multicultural kids holding hands on some brick wall by a community play area. Nice stuff.
Damon's smile was infectious.
Welcoming stuff. Created a name for myself. People started posting my stuff all over social media, tried seeking me out.
He shrugged.
It was good. People liked it. It was something I could do to earn cash, build a tag, and still do with crippled hands. Met a few people on the streets when I was out there, got offers of a place to stay, especially when I couldn't keep up the university course anymore. I had no choice, Patrick. The first guy seemed genuine. Thought he really liked me, until my hands were useless for more than sketching.
Patrick furrowed his brow.
I couldn't toss him off anymore.
Right. Patrick shuffled up on the bed.
Of course. He chucked me out. Found me somewhere else. Apparently the bastard had spread the news that I do favours, but only with my mouth.
Damon. Patrick closed his eyes, unable and unwilling to understand all this.
I didn't go seeking it. I never would. But if it was a choice between a park bench or to give someone a favour for a comfy bed, well, sometimes it's an easy choice.
I'm not so sure about that.
Come back to me when you're in that situation.
I hope I never am.
Me too. But you talk to people on the street. You must realise how we're all a few steps away from homelessness. No one chooses that life. It chooses us. When you have no one and nothing, it's all there is.
But you said you were at your sister's for a time.
Yeah, for a while. A few months now. So I haven't had to do any of that for a long time. I'll be on my mate's sofa from tomorrow, who I know won't want anything, so that's another bit of respite from it.
Damon peered up, meeting Patrick's gaze through lowered lashes.
Then you showed up.
He shrugged.
I'd make an exception for you.
Inhaling, Damon gazed at him, lingering and assuredly.
'Cause I have a thing for redheads and freckles.
Patrick didn't say anything. Rendered speechless, he sat in silence, contemplating what to do next. What to say. What to admit. That he, too, had an attraction to rough and tough men who beneath it were soft and poetic. How did he even know that?
I know what you must think.
Damon sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees and dangling his hands down as he shook them out.
Do you? That I'm a low-life scum?
Damon tilted his head to the side to catch his eye.
Whether you were attracted to me on first glance, I've lost it all now, right? Lost any respect.
Damon.
It's all right.
Damon smiled, cheekbones rising.
I have a habit of losing the things that do me well. I'll add you to the list.
He held up his hands.
Along with these.
He winced, then began massaging his knuckles awkwardly. Vulnerability seeped through toughened skin, and Patrick couldn't help himself. Without thinking, he slid his hand down Damon's arm, tugging Damon's hand onto his lap. Damon turned to face him, lips parting. Patrick had no idea what he was doing, but he'd decided several hours back to help this man, and after hearing everything, he still wanted to. So he massaged his thumb over each swollen knuckle on Damon's hand.
Is that okay?
Patrick asked through barely a whisper.
Yeah,
Damon breathed out.
Yeah, it's good. It helps.
Patrick smiled. Taking Damon's hand in both of his, he rubbed generously through each digit. He'd never given a massage before, but he guessed it was instinct taking over as Damon fluttered his eyes closed, a gentle, pleasing hum emitting from smiling lips.
"Does anyone do this for you?"
Patrick asked through the silence.
"My sister."
Patrick preoccupied himself by smoothing his fingers over the red-hot joints on Damon's hand. Although it was only fingertips and folds of skin, it was still flesh on flesh, and that was something Patrick had no real experience of. And whilst the heat mostly came from Damon's inflammation, Patrick couldn't help but wonder if it was from him, from his touch, from this moment.
"You're good."
Damon smiled, eyes still closed.
"Not too rough, not too soft. Kel can sometimes get a bit rough with it, like she's had enough. It's surprisingly therapeutic for me too."
He didn't say why. He didn't admit that it was because this was the first time he'd ever allowed himself to touch another man, even though he'd been begging to do so for years.
"So what about you, Patrick?"
Damon's deep voice broke the silence.
"Why would you bring a stranger into your home, one you admit that you find attractive, and yet remain at arm's length?"
Patrick snorted and lifted Damon's hand.
"Hardly arm's length. Is there a man in your life, Patrick? One who would be breaking down that door if I'm still here in the morning?"
Patrick licked quivering lips, unsure why at that point his body had betrayed him by trembling. He shook his head. Realizing Damon still had his eyes shut, he had to force his voice to speak.
No, not at all. Well, unless you count my father."
Patrick hadn't realized he had been massaging Damon's knuckles a tad too hard until Damon sucked in a breath through gritted teeth.
"But I'm not expecting him to pop by any time soon."
Damon yanked his hand away and smoothed over the joint.
"Too rough. Sorry. Something troubling you, Patrick?"
"No." Patrick exhaled, holding Damon's gaze to the point it coerced, it coaxed, it cajoled him into surrender.
"Yes."
Damon cocked his head, gaze not leaving his. Patrick's stomach fluttered as though on a full-cycle spin-wash. Then his whole life suddenly changed when, for the first time, the thing he had been waiting for and forbidden to have edged closer and closer and closer. Then Damon pressed soft, plump lips onto his, chaste and gentle and everything Patrick had ever wanted.